Thank you. I'm a bit of a cold, so I hope I will get through these 40 minutes. So let's cross fingers. So yeah, hello and welcome to my talk about securing OpenSearch. Experience has shown that one of the major challenges in getting an OpenSearch cluster up and running is really just configuring the security module. Many admins have been struggling here, and yeah, it seems to be a really challenging topic. So configuring security, that means especially TLS, authentication and authorization. In these upcoming 40 minutes, I won't be able to fix all this, but I will try to give you some guidance to avoid the major foot guns, to really know where to look at and what to avoid. One of the major reasons why security is so difficult is when you open the documentation, you will see actually hundreds of options you can choose from. Your average config file looks like this, and yeah, it's of course difficult. Of course, every option probably has its justification, but you have to say it, some are really nice. And in some cases, in this very extremely diverse world of environments, these have their justification, but in most cases, they don't. So the actual art is to learn what's important and what's not so important, what you might just skip over. And yeah, where are the foot traps where you shouldn't be stepping on? And that's what we will be looking at. As this is a very broad area, this presentation will be quite a fast ride, so apologies for that. It won't be comprehensive, but yeah, it will be just the major points to look out. If you have detailed questions, yeah, just come to me later and we can talk about these then. By the way, I'm Nils. I've been working in the area of security for OpenSearch already for years, together with a company called Eliatra. Eliatra and its predecessor companies have been working also on the basis of the security plugin for OpenSearch. That's why we know a bit about this. And yeah, Eliatra, the OpenSearch experts, is a company dedicated to one thing: to support and improve OpenSearch. So if you need support for OpenSearch, Eliatra can offer you some great packages. And Eliatra also offers the OpenSearch distro, which fulfills many important enterprise needs. But enough of this. Let's now jump into the actual topic. So the configuration of the OpenSearch security model can be broken into three major building blocks. TLS for secure communication, authentication for identifying who's accessing your cluster, and well, authorization to control and to limit the access of authenticated users. We'll go through each of these in the following minutes. TLS. Every one of you probably knows it. The main purposes of TLS generally are keeping communication confidential by encryption and ensuring the authenticity of peers by signatures. Looking at an OpenSearch cluster, which is in its simplest form shaped like this, we have the following situation. Generally, without TLS, OpenSearch is quite liberal in allowing new nodes to join a cluster. As soon as you can establish a TCP connection and the cluster name matches, a cluster will gladly accept any newly popping up new node into the cluster. This can be very useful, but of course, security-wise, that might be also critical. And TLS helps here to secure this. TLS makes sure that only authorized nodes can join the cluster. However, the challenge here also, setting up TLS can be pretty involved. We will need many certificates and many keys. For this 3-node cluster, in a standard scenario, we need, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pairs of certificates and private keys. And well, a 3-node cluster is kind of the minimum. You can imagine if you have more nodes, that will be more stuff. What do we need these certificates for? So first of all, for each node, we need certificates for the internal transport layer communication between the nodes of a cluster. We need certificates and keys for the REST interfaces of the nodes. And we need at least one certificate and key as a client authentication mechanism for the superadmin user. So what tools do we have to help us a bit in creating so many certificates? And yeah, this is kind of an overview of our options. There's the OpenSearch Kubernetes operator, which is on its own a quite cool thing, which helps us in many ways to operate an OpenSearch cluster. And it has also the option of auto-generating TLS certificates, which is cool. However, there's also a trap. By the way, if you see this little warning sign over there, this is the symbol for things to look out for. In the case of the Kubernetes operator, these automatically generated certificates expire after 1 year. Of course, this is a standard property of certificates. However, there is no well-documented, straightforward way to renew these certificates automatically. So if you don't have this in mind, the cluster will just die after a year. So this is a bit critical for production purposes. If you don't talk about production systems, but only about test systems, OpenSearch comes with demo certificates, which are just pre-generated, but yeah, these also don't help you really. In the end, it's really, at the moment, mostly manual work, very busy manual work, where you really have to follow the documentation to really make sure that the certificates follow the requirements. One new thing which Eliatra is going to offer you is the Eliatra TLS tool for OpenSearch, which is based actually on the TLS tool that's already around for years for SearchGuard. Maybe you have known it. That is also for a security plugin for the predecessor of OpenSearch. And this TLS tool is really tailored towards defining or generating certificates for an OpenSearch cluster. You just specify very basic fundamental information about your cluster. So like the CA, the certificate authority you're going to use, the nodes you are going to have in your cluster, and maybe also the admin certificates you're needing. Just execute the tool, and then in the result, you will get all the certificates and keys you will needing, including fragments of the configuration files you're going to need. Yeah, that's really cool. That really helps you in configuring such a cluster. And it's not available at the moment, but we will try to release it until the end of the week. So just check out eliatra.com for this tool. But so much for this tool. Let's go on for some more interesting things on TLS. Another trap on TLS. By default, in the OpenSearch Security plugin, TLS is disabled on the REST layer, which doesn't make sense at all. So don't think about this default, just change it, and then have a working cluster really without having this. Many things won't work as you would expect, and it's probably also not safe. Also, one thing people might not expect in the beginning is in the OpenSearch config, you need to explicitly name all the certificates, or not all, but many certificates you will be using. So you need to name the certificates, so the distinguished names of the certificates you will be using for the internal communication of the nodes. This is kind of this example.com, OOSearch, OTestTest, blah, blah, blah. And in addition, you also need to name the distinguished names of all the super admin certificates. This is for security reasons, but well, maybe sometimes not expected, but because usually it's only about trust and not about particular nodes or clients which you are accessing. By the way, the fact that you need to specify the distinguished names of all the node certificates could be even used as a justification that you can disable hostname verification, at least for the inner cluster communication on the transport level protocol. Usually, hostname verification is a central security mechanism of TLS, but this kind of works similarly, just only on a different identity of these certificates. As hostname verification is kind of like often something very troubling, especially on the transport layer. Yeah, it might be justifiable to use this as a replacement. And this really also simplifies the configuration, because many actually are struggling with cluster internal hostname verification. So much for TLS. There's much more, certainly, but we need to go on. So after having TLS working, we can now move on to configuring the actual authentication and authorization. Before doing that, we should briefly add how the general abstract configuration mechanisms of the security plugin work. This gives us some good strategies on managing actually the configuration. So far, we only looked, when we were talking about configuration, about the OpenSearch YAML configuration file. But actually, we have a couple more configuration files. What's special, or what's kind of the standard property of OpenSearch YAML is when you change its configuration, you need to restart the node to make the configuration changes effective. This is kind of a standard property. However, sometimes also a hassle, and that's why we have further configuration files which can be changed at runtime. These are kind of a number of additional configuration files of the OpenSearch security plugin, which can be changed at runtime. But it depends on how you're actually setting up the cluster to know how you're actually able to change these configuration files. In the basic default scenario, you have a dedicated tool which is used to upload these configuration files to the cluster. This is the so-called security admin tool. Even though this is the basic scenario, you see, using this command isn't so basic. It's usually having very long command lines, so often you want to create a kind of wrapper around this. One wrapper could be just writing a shell script, which calls this. But also we will see other ways to configure the cluster also often create wrappers around the script. So besides the security admin tool, we have further ways to control configuration updates. When talking about the OpenSearch Helm charts, there's this file called values YAML, which has a section which defines the content of these configuration files individually. That's the standard way for Helm charts, kind of like. There is also a catch, however. Out of the box, it only works for initial values. So you can define the values you want here, pull up your cluster, and then you get the cluster running with these defined values. But if you want to change these values later, it won't work just reapplying the SAM chart. You actually need to rerun the security admin tool on that cluster then. That might be a bit unexpected, at least I was kind of thinking, oh, why did I change now my values, but they didn't actually change. Yeah, it's just because another core of the security admin tools needed. We have the OpenSearch Kubernetes operator, which supports a Kubernetes secret for storing these configuration files. This is really greatly integrated. This is the best integration I've seen so far for OpenSearch. This works really well and without any warnings to make. Additionally, we have a REST API, which allows very detailed changes of the configuration, and also a plugin for OpenSearch dashboards, which adds a UI to configure the security. However, one has to say, one has to take care not to mix update mechanisms too badly, because then you might run in the end into inconsistencies. For example, if you use the Kubernetes secrets to define your configuration, and later use the REST API or the dashboards UI to change it, if you apply the Kubernetes secret again, all the changes by the REST API or the dashboards UI will be gone. And this is something you need to keep in mind if you really want to use the REST API or the dashboards UI. It might be nice to use a UI, but it certainly will lead into trouble in case you're going to update your cluster centrally. So, in case of mission-critical systems where unavailability is a no-go, really put your configuration files into version management and avoid the REST API and the UI and dashboards. If you really want to use the REST API, you can use some strategies to prevent accidental overwriting. In case of the Kubernetes operator, you can remove individual config files, for example, just the roles from the secret, and say, I'm now configuring all the roles with dashboards. Also, the same works if you just use plainly the security admin tool. Just remove the particular file from the directory, and then it won't be overwritten. If you use this, however, also a word of advice, regularly create backups from your security configuration, because if you just manage it by a UI, normally backups won't be created, and you really need to have some management here. Final warning, just tangentially related. If you're configuring production systems, you should care to remove all demo configurations. So OpenSearch Security comes with demo configurations, which are of course nice to study to see how things working. However, often it's forgotten. It's just a demo configuration, and it's just ending up on the production system. And you probably don't want to have users with predefined passwords just sitting around on your production system. So keep in mind to remove especially entries in internal users and in the role mapping. Enough for this configuration management. Now, finally, let's move on to the authentication topic. We have quite a few authentication modes available. These are available in the OpenSearch core security. Additionally, when you're using dashboards, you will get some more SSO authentication modes. I won't be able to go into the details on this. I will just give an overview of what to keep in mind about authentication abstractly or independently of the individual modules. Here we can see an example configuration file for authentication. Just want to highlight a few important things. We can have several authentication modes at once. So here we're having JWT, we're having basic authentication with an LDAP backend and basic authentication with an internal user database backend. These are checked in a chain of responsibility design pattern. That means we're going through these authentication domains one by one, and the first one who is successful in authenticating a user wins, kind of like. Of course, for this pattern, we need to define an order in which these authentication modules are checked. And yeah, this is done by the equally named attribute. Something which might be not clear upwards, at least for me, is whether this order is actually an ascending number or a descending number, kind of like a priority. It's ascending. So 0 is checked first, 10 is checked last, if 10 is the highest number. Also, just a tip, be sure to have distinct numbers. Doubling up numbers will have funny effects. Final thing about this, if you're going to use basic authentication, the challenge flag is kind of interesting. So you might know basic authentication in a web browser. This gives you this nice pop-up to enter username and password. And without a challenge, you won't have this pop-up. So yeah, if you're using basic authentication, you want to have the challenge flag set to true in exactly one authentication domain. Don't ask me why, but don't set it to true in 2 authentication domains. It won't work as you expect. Yeah, just have it to true at one authentication domain and be sure that it will be the last one in the list. Not any other, just the last one. It's a kind of weird rule, I know. We can talk about the reasons afterwards, but yeah, it will save you hassle doing this. The only reason to have challenge set to false for any basic authentication domain is using SAL for dashboards, but otherwise, yeah, it's really recommendable to have it true, at least for the last one. One more thing to know for applying configuration on authentication. OpenSearch Security doesn't provide you lots of checks when trying to apply a new authentication configuration. It does just some basic checks, whether it's a valid YAML file, but still you can upload a very invalid configuration file, which immediately will break your authentication. That's important to keep in mind, because that means on a production system, yeah, test it before uploading it to a production system. Have a test cluster ready where you can test it, and only if you're sure that it's working, upload it on the actual production system. When applying the authentication configuration, be sure to monitor your log files, because when you have some errors or issues inside, this information will only pop up in the log files. By the way, if you're monitoring the log files, look out for the packages listed here. These are the ones which give you the important information. Pardon. Also, one important thing is keep in mind that OpenSearch Security caches users. So, for example, when using LDAP as an authentication backend, the security model will query the LDAP backend only once. And if authentication is successful, it will reuse this user information for the next 60 minutes by default. If you want to give a user new roles, for example, in LDAP, yeah, then it won't happen until this cache is expired, which also might be not obvious. You have a configuration option also to control this cache duration, so you could also think about reducing this duration or even disabling the cache altogether by setting it to 0. However, yeah, for performance reasons, that's also not too recommendable. You can also delete manually the cache either with the security admin tool and the -RL switch, or with a dedicated REST API. So much for authentication. Now quickly on the final track to the authorization topic. Authorization is kind of by configuration files and by structures, kind of the most complicated topic. So you can see here kind of a diagram of all the concepts we are having here involved. On the left, we can see the backend roles, which are retrieved from an authentication backend. That's why it's called backend roles. Here we see some groups from LDAP, which serve as backend roles. And on the right, we have another role concept, which is in OpenSearch terms often just referred to as roles. In roles YAML, we have role names associated with individual permissions. However, these are not directly connected, these backend roles and this roles YAML file. You have first to go through role mapping to map backend roles into effective roles. In the easiest way, it's just a mapping from strings to strings. However, this roles mapping is actually quite a Swiss Army knife. You actually can also just map usernames or IP addresses to OpenSearch roles. Even with wildcards, you can provide roles for every user globally in a cluster. Yeah, and in the end, you will get the effective roles, which are then used for actually applying the access control on your cluster. Let's have a look at a very simple example of roles. You can see we have our roles fall into two parts. We have index permissions and cluster permissions. Index permissions always come with an index pattern, so these apply only for a selected set of indices. Cluster permissions are kind of the global permissions. You also could have just called them global permissions. These are independent of indices. So what do I mean when I actually say permission? In the OpenSearch Security plugin, a permission is either an identifier of a particular internal OpenSearch action, or it's an action group. Here we see two action groups. We see the action group CRUD and the action group cluster composite operations. There are a few action groups predefined in OpenSearch. You will find these on the documentation websites to just make your life easier. Advice: prefer to use these predefined action groups to make your life easier, because they will certainly make your life easier. Just as a comparison, we have the same role here, not using action groups, but just the actual actions. Yeah, it's a bit more complicated, and it will be a hassle to maintain this. Pardon me. Let's have a look at a read-only example. So here we define read-only access to a set of indices. You can see here what's interesting is we have two action groups or two permissions here. We have the read action group, which gives us the permissions on the indices themselves. And in addition, we have a cluster permission action group, which gives us access to certain composite operations. We will come a bit later onto that, what this actually means. Comparing this with a read and write example, we see the read action group has changed into CRUD, and the cluster permissions, we lost the RO at the end of the action group. This RO just stands for read only, and now we have the full. A challenge when configuring the permissions here is to know what permission is actually a cluster permission and what permission is an index permission. We have the name of the action ID, which might be used as a hint, However, it's misleading. I have to drink a bit, unfortunately. I hope I will get this through. At least my throat will allow me this. But yeah, it's misleading. So you see, both action IDs start with indices, but one is ending up in the cluster permissions and one is ending up in the indices permissions. That's confusing, but it needs to be this way. You could also add this msearch to the index permissions. Nothing will prevent you from that. You won't get a validation error message, but nothing will happen. It won't have any effect. That's because multi-search, msearch is multi-search, triggers actually additional actions. On the top level, you have a multi-search operation, but it's just creating additional search operations. And these search operations are also just normal search operations. So for actually requiring these multi-search operations, it's just you always need to have 2 levels of permissions. Yeah, as I said before, the action type cannot be told from the action ID, and indices actions are not necessarily index actions. This is important to keep in mind when configuring authorization. Oops, this is a bit misformatted, but yeah, how to tell which is which? Either you just check the docs for the action groups. This will tell you for the action groups at least, which is a cluster permission and which is an index permission. If you want to have it really exactly, you can also just check the code at this link, or which is also some quite handy mechanism, check the log outputs. We will come back to that. We will come to that very quickly. Just to recap this pattern with the 2-level privileges, that's a pattern you will see very often. So just an example here. We will have msearch and search in this 2-level pattern. The same holds for mget and get. And we have actually quite a few more actions which work this way. So yeah, just keep in mind, this is a standard pattern you will often have to apply when configuring complex actions that you need to have several permissions for one actions. And yeah, just repeating the recommendation, if you use just the action groups, these have them already all included. So yeah, now finally let's come to how to debug permission issues. Yeah, even if you take greatest care in configuring permissions for OpenSearch security, in the end you will end up needing to debug permission issues. And there are several ways to do this. The easiest way, or the most direct way, is just to look at the error message you're getting in the REST interface. One error message looks like this. And yeah, you will have here the action ID, you will have the username, and have the backend roles, which yeah, are medium helpful in debugging these issues. Also, a funny case is this: no permissions for square brackets. Yeah, not too helpful. But yeah, there are other ways we can also use for debugging permission issues. Often cited are the audit logs. This is here a shortened example for an audit log record. In reality, it will be kind of 10 times as long. And we can see here we actually don't have so much more information. So audit logs aren't really much more helpful than the error messages. What is actually more helpful is the OpenSearch logs themselves. So I would really, really recommend to check these logs. Watch out, for example, for the privileged evaluator logs of this form, which, first of all, has information no index level permission. And this tells you, we talk about an index permission here. There's also the information, a cluster level permission, which would tell you that you would need to define a cluster permission. We have username and backend roles, which is okay. But we also have here at roles checks the effective roles, which is much more important actually when debugging authorization issues, because this tells you whether the role mapping worked correctly, and you can also directly check the roles YAML file. So yeah, use these logs. Also remember the no permissions for square brackets error message. In the logs you would see this, that I actually tried to access a protected index. So yeah, check the logs. It will be much more helpful than the error messages themselves. By default, the logs which we've been seeing are visible in the OpenSearch logs, so these are logged in the default configuration. If you have disabled these default configuration logs, you can enable these, by the way, with this REST call. The cool thing about OpenSearch that you can change the log levels during runtime with a REST API. And if you're really fancy, yeah, maybe create a data prepper integration on these particular logs and log all your error messages to a separate logging cluster and have a great dashboards integration to manage all your privilege issues. But yeah, that was quite a rush. Let's come to an end here. So we've seen many parts of the security configuration rushed by, but it's were only really some essentials. But there's so much more. And just an overview of what's potentially more. So there are many expert-level configuration options, really many expert-level configuration options. Non-comprehensive list is listed here. But as a word of caution, yeah, really only use expert-level configuration options if you studied them well. Usually in 90% of the cases you won't need them, and you also will be more happy if you won't need them. Some more interesting topics are configuration options I like do not fail and forbidden. I also didn't touch DLS FLS today, which also has interesting implications. User impersonation for testing is also interesting, or strategies for making your cluster more robust against configuration issues are some topic one could talk about. Cross-cluster search and cross-cluster replication are quite useful. Sometimes you're wondering what are these actually for. But yeah, one use case is really making your cluster more robust against config issues. But yeah, we won't talk about these in this session, but if you want, we could talk about it afterwards. Just come up to me. And this is it. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope what was a bit helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Maybe somebody has questions. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. So who has very interesting question for our speaker about security? Maybe somebody right now making more secure OpenSearch and somebody wants to ask questions. Okay, no question. Maybe I will ask you, what is the common problem for all people that you met? What's the most common things they forget about with OpenSearch?
Forget about?
Yeah.
Well, so I think one thing which is often forgotten, I mentioned it, is leaving example configuration on your production system. So there's this role own index, which is automatically applied for all users, and which gives them read access to private index, which often is not needed. And yeah, deleting example configuration is a very common thing which is forgotten.
to know. So thank you very much, and thank you. Yep. So we have 5 minutes break. Okay, you have question. No, you don't have.
Just shout it in. Question.
Yeah.
Okay. So you were talking about observing or checking out logs whenever the security configuration is wrong. Do you think there is a possibility to have some kind of automation built around that? Because we are dealing with user-provided configuration, and we only know whether it's wrong after we've applied it. And we are completely clueless, and because we offer a hosted service, we need to actually check out the logs. Customers can't actually access.
Yeah, well, it's the easiest way to answer is yes and no. In theory, certainly there are many ways to deal with it, but they have to be built. And I guess it would require to really rebuild some parts here really fundamentally to have this secure. But I totally agree, this is kind of a very big shortcoming of what we have at the moment, where one might think about rebuilding it, but it will be kind of a challenge to do it.